It was a bright Sunday morning in a quiet town where everyone knew each other's faces, if not their names. The streets were calm, the shops were just opening, and the smell of coffee drifted through the air. A man named David Carter drove his old red pickup truck down Main Street. The truck had a few scratches and dents, but it ran smoothly, a reflection of David himself. Rough on the outside, strong and dependable inside. David wasn't just any man. He was a local firefighter, known for being calm under pressure and always ready to help anyone in need. He had spent years risking his life to save others, but he never bragged about it. For him, kindness and courage were part of everyday life. That morning, he was heading to a community event at the town park where kids were being taught about safety and first aid. He had promised to show them how to handle emergencies, the kind of lessons that could one day save lives. As he turned onto Oak Street, he noticed a police car parked behind a small cafe. A few moments later, the car pulled out and started following him. David didn't think much of it at first. He was driving slowly, obeying all the rules, but then the red and blue lights flashed behind him. He pulled over carefully to the side of the road, unsure why he was being stopped. The officer stepped out, tall, in his late 40s, wearing dark sunglasses and a hard expression. His name was Officer Miller, and he was known around town for being strict. Maybe too strict. Some people said he judged too quickly, especially when it came to certain people. "License and registration," Miller said sharply. Walking up to the truck window, David rolled down his window, polite but puzzled. "Sure, officer. Can I ask what's the reason for the stop?" Miller frowned. "We've had reports about a vehicle matching this description being involved in suspicious activity," he said. His tone was cold, like he had already made up his mind about David. David calmly handed over his license and registration. "This is my work truck. I'm just heading to the park for a safety event." Miller glanced at the papers but didn't seem to believe him. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. David hesitated for a second, then did as told. People nearby began to slow down and look, some whispering to each other. A few even took out their phones and started recording. David could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he kept his voice even and respectful. He had learned long ago that anger only made things worse. Miller started asking questions: where he lived, what he was doing, why his truck looked so old and damaged. Each question sounded more like an accusation than curiosity. David answered honestly every time, trying to keep the situation calm. But he could see in the officer's eyes that his words weren't really being heard. The officer checked the truck's interior, even though there was no reason to. Inside were just some firefighter gear: gloves, a helmet, a first aid kit, and a rolled-up safety banner for the event. Miller's tone grew more suspicious when he saw the gear. "What's all this?" he asked. David smiled faintly. "I'm a firefighter. These are my tools." Miller scoffed a little, looking at the dusty helmet. "You expect me to believe that?" David didn't argue. He just nodded slowly. "You can call the fire station if you need to confirm." By now, a small crowd had gathered at a distance. A few people were whispering, recognizing David from local news stories about his rescue work. One woman said quietly, "That's the firefighter who saved those kids from the river last year." Miller didn't seem to hear. His focus stayed fixed on David, as if trying to find something wrong. The tension grew thicker, every second stretching longer than it should have. Finally, Miller's radio crackled. A voice on the other end said something quietly, and Miller paused. He looked back at David, then at the papers again. His tone shifted slightly, but his pride didn't let him admit any mistake. "You can go," he said curtly, handing back the documents. "Just be more careful next time." David took them calmly. "Of course, officer," he said softly. He didn't say anything else, even though his heart felt heavy. He got back into his truck and drove off slowly, the crowd watching silently as the lights faded in his mirror. As he turned the corner, David exhaled deeply. It wasn't the first time someone had judged him by how he looked, but it still hurt. Not because he was angry, but because it reminded him how far people still had to go to understand one another. He thought about the kids waiting for him at the park and decided not to let the morning ruin his day. He had a duty to teach them not just about safety, but about patience, respect, and staying calm under pressure. Meanwhile, back at the corner, some of the onlookers had uploaded short clips of the stop online. Within hours, the video began spreading across social media. It showed only bits of the interaction, enough to stir opinions and arguments. Some viewers were furious, calling it another example of unfair treatment. Others defended the officer, saying he was just doing his job. The town suddenly found itself divided over something that should never have happened in the first place. David didn't know about the video yet. At the park, he was surrounded by children showing them how to bandage wounds and check for breathing. His smile was real, steady, calm, the kind that comes from doing what you love. But inside, a part of him still felt uneasy. Not because of what happened to him, but because he knew things like that happened to too many people. Later that afternoon, one of his fellow firefighters showed him the video on his phone. David watched quietly, saying nothing at first. It felt strange seeing himself on the screen. Respectful, polite, yet treated as if he'd done something wrong. "Man, that's not right," his friend said. "You should talk to someone about it." David shook his head. "Talking won't change how people think overnight," he said softly. "I'd rather show them who we really are by how we live." That night, as the sun went down, the clip kept spreading. News outlets picked it up. Reporters began calling the fire station asking for comments. Some community members defended David publicly, praising his patience and dignity. Others criticized the police department, asking for an explanation. Officer Miller, on the other hand, tried to ignore the storm. He told himself he had followed procedure, that there was nothing wrong with what he did. But deep inside, something about the look in David's eyes stayed with him. Calm, disappointed, not angry, just sad. It was the kind of look that stayed with a person long after the noise faded. By the next morning, the story had reached beyond their small town. David received messages of support from people he had never met. Firefighters, teachers, veterans, and ordinary citizens who admired how he handled the situation. Some even called him a hero, though he didn't see himself that way. To him, heroes weren't people who went viral on the internet. Heroes were those who kept doing what was right even when no one was watching. Still, the incident left a quiet mark on both men. For David, it was a reminder that the world still judged too quickly, but it also strengthened his resolve to live with kindness and grace. For Officer Miller, though he didn't admit it yet, the event had planted a small seed of doubt, a seed that would soon grow into something unexpected, something that would change his life forever. The town slowly went back to normal, but something in the air had shifted. People talked more about fairness and respect. Teachers discussed it in classrooms, and even at the diner downtown, the regulars debated about how things could be better. It was as if one uncomfortable moment had forced everyone to look at themselves differently. And as for David, he kept showing up. At the fire station, at community events, and whenever someone needed help. He carried himself with quiet strength, not realizing that his calm response had already begun to inspire others. Sometimes justice doesn't start with a courtroom or a protest. Sometimes it begins with one person choosing not to let anger define the moment. David didn't know it yet, but the same officer who had stopped him unfairly would soon find himself standing on the other side of that truth, when life would give him a chance to see who David really was. That day wasn't far away. Few days passed since that morning on Oak Street, but the memory of it didn't leave the town easily. The short video clip kept moving from one phone to another, spreading faster than anyone expected. What was once just a quiet stop on the side of the road had now turned into a topic everyone seemed to have an opinion about. At the local cafe, people whispered while sipping their coffee. Some said the officer had gone too far. Others said maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But one thing was clear, everyone knew about it. The small town that once moved at its own slow, peaceful pace suddenly felt divided. The firefighter, David, didn't like the attention. He wasn't the type who looked for fame. He'd always believed in doing good quietly, helping people without expecting thanks. Now people he didn't even know were stopping him on the street, shaking his hand and calling him brave for how calmly he handled the situation. Some even wanted him to speak out against the officer, to give interviews or file a complaint. But David wasn't sure that was the right thing to do. He spent most of his time at the fire station trying to stay busy, but the talk never really stopped. His fellow firefighters were angry for him. They told him he should defend himself, that the officer had embarrassed him unfairly. David would just smile and say, "Getting angry won't make anyone see clearer." Inside, though, it wasn't that easy. He wasn't made of stone. He still remembered the look in the officer's eyes. That cold doubt, that quick judgment. It wasn't new to him, but every time it happened, it hurt in the same quiet way. Still, he chose to hold on to calmness. He believed that peace was stronger than pride. Meanwhile, Officer Miller was having a harder time than he showed. He'd been in the force for almost 2 decades and thought he'd seen it all. He had always told himself he treated everyone the same, but deep down, he knew that wasn't completely true. Old habits, old fears, old stories, they all played their part. When the video first went online, Miller thought it would blow over in a day or two. But as the views climbed and the comments grew sharper, the police department began to feel the pressure. Reporters called for statements, and even the chief had to step forward and say they were reviewing the incident. At home, Miller's teenage son asked him quietly one evening, "Dad, did you really stop that firefighter for no reason?" Miller felt a sting of shame he didn't expect. "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "I was just doing my job." His son nodded but didn't seem convinced. That silence hurt more than any public criticism. The next day at the station, his colleagues avoided the topic. Some quietly supported him, others kept their distance. Miller started feeling the weight of something he couldn't name. Not guilt exactly, but the uneasy feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a mistake. David, on the other hand, decided to use what happened as a lesson. When the town's community center invited him to speak about calmness under pressure, he accepted. He didn't talk about the officer directly, but he shared stories from his work, about how panic and anger only make things worse, how patience can save lives, and how understanding people is often harder than running into a burning building. The audience listened quietly. Some clapped, others just nodded, lost in thought. For many, his words hit deeper than he intended. One woman came up to him afterward and said, "The way you handled that situation was powerful. You didn't fight hate with hate. You showed what strength really looks like." David smiled softly. "Real strength is staying human," he replied. Still, not everyone saw it that way. A few people online accused him of being too soft, saying he should have spoken out more strongly. But David didn't want to fuel anger. He knew that anger might feel powerful in the moment, but it rarely healed anything. That weekend, the fire department held a charity event for the children's hospital. David was in charge of leading the safety demonstrations again. Families gathered in the park and laughter filled the air. For a few hours, everything felt normal again. But across town, Officer Miller sat in his car parked near the river. He had been put on temporary leave while the department handled the public reaction. It wasn't a punishment exactly, or more like a cooling-off period. Still, it felt heavy. He scrolled through his phone and came across the video once more. Watching it with fresh eyes, he saw what others had seen. Not just his firm tone, but the way David had stood there, calm, steady, almost patient with him. There was no anger in his face, only quiet dignity. For the first time, Miller saw how wrong he had looked. He sighed deeply, turning off the screen. He didn't know how to fix it. Pride had always come easy to him, but apologies never did. A few days later, life went on. David kept doing his job, responding to calls, rescuing pets from trees, checking smoke alarms for elderly residents. Every now and then, someone would bring up the incident and he would just nod politely, changing the topic. He believed that time had its own way of settling things. Then came one unexpected evening. The wind had been strong all day, and by nightfall a small electrical fire broke out on the edge of town. Within minutes it spread faster than anyone expected. David's team got the call and rushed out. Flames rose high against the dark sky, lighting up the street in orange. People stood outside their houses, worried and frightened. David quickly took charge, barking calm, clear orders to his team. "Get the hose lines ready. Check if anyone's inside." As the team worked, another emergency vehicle pulled up, a police cruiser. And stepping out was none other than Officer Miller. He hadn't been called to the scene officially. He'd heard it on the radio and came to help with traffic control. For a moment, he froze when he saw who was leading the rescue. The same man he had stopped weeks ago. David noticed him too, but didn't show any reaction. He was focused on the fire. There was no time for old grudges. 2 people still inside. One firefighter shouted. Without thinking twice, David grabbed his mask and ran into the burning building with another crew member. The smoke was thick, the heat almost unbearable. They found a young child hiding under a table and carried him out first, then went back for the older woman trapped in a bedroom. Outside, Miller watched, his heart racing. He saw the flames licking the windows, saw the danger, and for the first time, felt something like fear, not for himself, but for the man inside. Minutes later, David emerged, coughing, his uniform covered in soot, holding the woman safely in his arms. The crowd cheered, but he barely heard them. His only focus was getting everyone safe. Miller rushed forward without thinking, helping the woman to the ambulance. Their eyes met for a second, just a brief moment, but enough. Miller saw the same calmness again, the same quiet strength, but this time it wasn't distant. It was real, raw, human. David nodded slightly in acknowledgement before turning back to his crew. That night, as the fire was finally brought under control, Miller sat on the curb, staring at the ground. Everything he had believed about strength and pride felt small compared to what he had just witnessed. The man he had once doubted, even disrespected, had just risked his life to save strangers. Without hesitation, without bitterness, without judgment. Something changed in Miller that night. He didn't say anything then, but deep down he knew he had to make things right. David, on his part, didn't think much about it. To him, it was just another day of doing what was right. But life had its own way of connecting hearts, and sometimes justice doesn't come through punishment. It comes through realization. As the sirens faded and the crowd dispersed, both men went home quietly. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night's fire had lit more than just flames. It had sparked the beginning of a lesson, one that would soon bring them face to face again, not as a firefighter and an officer, but as two human beings finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. The morning after the fire, the town was quiet but uneasy. People still talked about the blaze, how fast it had spread, and how many lives had been at risk. For most, it was another event in small-town life, but for some, it had been a moment that changed how they saw the world. The firefighter, David, woke up early, just as he always did. His body ached from the night before. Smoke and heat left marks he would feel for days, but he didn't complain. He had slept for only a few hours, yet his mind was already on the next call, the next responsibility. Helping others wasn't something he did because of recognition. It was who he was. At the fire station, the crew gathered to clean equipment and restock supplies. The older members teased him gently, asking if he was going to take the day off. He just smiled and shook his head. There was work to do, and taking pride in doing it safely was enough reward for him. Meanwhile, Officer Miller couldn't shake the images from his mind. He had watched David rush into flames without a second thought. He had seen him pull people out coughing and burned, yet calm and focused. Miller sat at his kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee he didn't touch, feeling the weight of something he could not yet name. For the first time, he questioned himself. The doubts he had long ignored, about how he treated people, about his assumptions, and came rushing in. He remembered the stop weeks earlier, how he had questioned David's honesty and intentions, and now after seeing what true courage looked like, he couldn't ignore it. He tried to shake it off, telling himself he had only been doing his job, but the voice in his head kept repeating one simple thought. He had judged a man unfairly. That realization was heavy, more than he expected, and it left a quiet ache in his chest. Back at the fire station, David had returned to a normal routine as much as possible. There were reports to file, equipment to check, and community visits to plan. But a subtle change had begun in the way people looked at him. Residents approached him not just with questions about safety, but with stories about how they had seen courage in everyday life, stories they connected to what he had done. The local newspaper ran a piece on the fire. They didn't focus on the minor damages or the technical details of the response. They focused on the heroism of the people involved, naming David specifically. The article highlighted how calmness, quick thinking, and courage had saved lives. David read the piece quietly in the lounge of the fire station. He didn't feel pride exactly. Pride was fleeting and often dangerous. What he felt was responsibility, a reminder that the work mattered, that someone's life could always depend on him being prepared. Weeks passed and life seemed to return to a steady rhythm. But for Miller, each day felt heavier than the last. He patrolled the same streets he had always known, yet the memory of David's courage kept coming back. He couldn't stop replaying the scene, the flames, the smoke, David moving with calm authority, the way people trusted him without question. It was a scene that left a mark on anyone who saw it clearly. One evening, Miller found himself at the community center, not because of work, but because he wanted to see something he had avoided, the people David had helped that day. He stayed at the back, observing quietly. Children who had been trapped in the fire were drawing pictures, smiling, laughing. Parents were telling stories about the bravery they had witnessed, and then David appeared. He was talking to a group of children about fire safety. He was showing them how to roll a blanket to smother flames and how to check doors for heat before opening them. His voice was calm, patient, and confident. Every word he spoke seemed to carry a lesson not just about safety, but about courage and responsibility. Miller felt a strange mixture of emotions. He had always believed that strength was about authority, about control. But now he saw strength differently. It was not in harsh words or strict orders. It was in quiet determination, in calm decision-making, and in the willingness to risk yourself for others without needing praise. After the session, David walked among the children, answering questions. One little boy tugged at his sleeve. "Did it hurt in the fire?" he asked. David knelt down, looking into the boy's eyes. "Yes," he said simply, "it hurt, but helping you was more important than the pain." The boy nodded, seemingly understanding something bigger than words. Miller watched from a distance. He saw David as more than a firefighter now. He saw him as a human being who lived by principles that went beyond fear, beyond assumptions. He realized that the encounter they had weeks ago on the street was nothing compared to the lesson David had just taught the town through action. That night, Miller went home and could not sleep. He turned over in his mind every detail of the past few weeks: the traffic stop, the fire, David's calm bravery. He finally understood that judgment without understanding could hurt more than anyone realized. It wasn't just about him being wrong. It was about the trust and respect that people deserved. Miller decided he needed to do something. Not for recognition, not for news stories, but because he knew that being a better person meant facing his own mistakes. The first step was small. He would apologize to David, not for appearances, but because it was the right thing to do. The next morning, David was at the fire station checking equipment. He had received a few messages from the community praising his calm response during the fire, but he didn't dwell on them. He was preparing for another day of work, another opportunity to help. Miller arrived at the station unannounced. He had rehearsed his words over and over in his mind, unsure how David would react. Would he be angry? Would he refuse to talk? Miller didn't know, but he had to try. David noticed him standing by the door. His expression was neutral, professional. "Officer Miller," he said. "Can I help you?" Miller took a deep breath. "Yes," he said. "I wanted to apologize. For the way I treated you a few weeks ago, it was wrong and I should have handled it differently." David studied him quietly for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," he said. "It takes courage to admit that. I accept your apology." For a brief moment, the tension of the past week seemed to dissolve. Two men who had met in misunderstanding and suspicion were now able to see each other as human beings, capable of mistakes and capable of change. They spoke quietly for a while. David didn't lecture and Miller didn't make excuses. They simply shared thoughts about responsibility, courage, and the challenges of making fair judgments under pressure. As the conversation ended, Miller realized that this interaction had changed him more than he expected. He had learned something invaluable. Respect is earned not by authority or fear, but by actions and character. And he had witnessed the highest form of that respect firsthand. Later that week, the town began to notice a subtle change in Miller's behavior. He started volunteering in small ways, helping organize community safety meetings and engaging more respectfully with residents. People noticed the difference, though they didn't fully understand why. Only David knew the full story, and he didn't need to say anything. David, meanwhile, continued his work as if nothing had changed. For him, life was about helping people, teaching lessons without expecting gratitude and staying calm in the face of fear. But he quietly acknowledged that the world around him was shifting, slowly because of the choices he and others made. The incident at the fire had not just saved lives physically. It had saved something deeper: trust, understanding, and the chance for change. In small moments, like quiet conversations or simple gestures, the town began to heal divisions that had seemed permanent. For both men, it was clear that life had handed them an unexpected gift. One had shown courage, the other had learned humility. Both had taken steps toward something bigger than themselves. That night, as David locked the doors at the fire station, he looked up at the stars. He thought about the fire, the children, the people he had helped, and even the officer who had once doubted him. He smiled quietly. Life was unpredictable, often unfair, but moments like these reminded him why it was worth staying calm, staying kind, and staying human. And somewhere in his home, Miller sat quietly, reflecting on the same events. He no longer saw himself as simply an officer doing his duty. He saw himself as someone learning, growing, and beginning to understand what real justice meant: respect, humility, and humanity. Neither man could have predicted how much that fire would change them. Neither knew how far-reaching the lesson would be. But both had taken the first steps, one through courage, the other through acknowledgement, toward a future where understanding could replace judgment, and action could replace assumptions. Life, as it often does, had given them both a moment they would never forget. Weeks passed since the fire that had shaken the town, but the memory of it lingered in every quiet corner. The people who had witnessed it, whether directly or through news coverage, continued to speak about the calm courage of the firefighter who had risked his life without hesitation. The officer who had once stopped him on the street for reasons he now could barely justify carried a different memory, a memory that refused to fade. The officer, Miller, had tried to bury the guilt and embarrassment he felt. He told himself that it was just part of his job, that he had acted as he thought necessary. But the image of David, calm and resolute amid roaring flames, refused to leave his mind. He saw not just the bravery but the humanity, a quiet strength that demanded respect not out of fear but because it was real. He began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The small gestures of kindness, the way neighbors helped each other without expectation, the silent sacrifices people made every day. Miller realized that respect wasn't given automatically with a badge. It had to be earned through actions, integrity, and empathy. The morning was crisp and the streets were unusually quiet. Miller found himself driving past the fire station without planning to. He didn't know why, but something inside him told him he needed to see David, to speak with him honestly, face to face. He parked a few blocks away and hesitated before walking in. Inside, the station was alive with the usual bustle. Hoses being checked, alarms tested, and colleagues joking quietly while preparing equipment. David was reviewing safety reports when he noticed Miller standing near the door. He paused, raising his hand in a small, neutral greeting. Miller swallowed hard. This wasn't just a visit. This was a moment he had been preparing for in his mind over and over for weeks. "David," he said quietly, I wanted to talk. "If that's okay?" David set aside his papers and gestured to a quiet corner of the room. "Of course," he said simply. He didn't show any judgment, no hint of past resentment. Just presence. Just attention. Miller took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. Weeks ago on Oak Street, I treated you unfairly. I made assumptions. I questioned your integrity without reason. And seeing what you did during the fire, it made me realize just how wrong I was." David nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He wasn't surprised. He had sensed that the officer was beginning to reflect, but he remained quiet, allowing Miller to speak. "It's hard for me to admit," Miller continued, his voice low, "but I've learned that authority doesn't automatically make someone right. Sometimes it blinds you to what really matters, and I want to be better. I want to respect people for who they are, not what I think they are." David studied him. There was honesty in Miller's eyes, a vulnerability that not many people showed. "Acknowledging that," he said softly, "is the first step. It's not easy to see your own mistakes, but it's necessary. Respect is built every day in every small choice we make." Miller nodded, a weight lifting slightly from his shoulders. "I want to do more than apologize," he said. "I want to take responsibility for my actions. I want to help in ways that matter." David smiled faintly. "Then start with small steps. Actions speak louder than words. You don't have to prove anything to me. You just have to show it consistently to the people around you." For the first time in a long while, Miller felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to fear or pride. He realized that change didn't come from announcements or public gestures. It came quietly, through effort and consistent choices. Over the next few days, Miller began visiting the fire station more frequently, not as an officer checking on protocol, but as someone genuinely interested in learning. He watched drills, listened carefully to David's explanations, and even joined in some of the community outreach programs. Children smiled when he helped. Residents thanked him when he volunteered, and slowly, he felt the difference it made in him. Humility replacing pride, understanding replacing judgment. David, in turn, didn't treat him differently. He recognized the effort but didn't overemphasize it. To him, real change was quiet, unshowy, and consistent. He encouraged Miller when appropriate and allowed him to find his own footing, knowing that true respect couldn't be forced. One afternoon, the town organized a community safety fair. David was in charge, as always, teaching kids about fire safety, demonstrating equipment, and answering questions from concerned parents. Miller was there, assisting with crowd control and helping with logistical tasks. It wasn't glamorous work, but he felt a strange sense of satisfaction in simply being helpful. At one point, a group of children ran to David, excitedly asking him to show how to use a fire extinguisher. David demonstrated carefully, making sure each child understood the steps. Miller watched quietly from a few feet away, noticing how natural David's patience was, how genuine his care was for the people around him. A young girl hesitated with the extinguisher, and David knelt beside her, whispering encouragement. Miller felt something shift inside him. The authority he had relied on for years suddenly seemed shallow compared to the quiet strength and kindness before him. After the demonstration, Miller approached David. "I see it now," he said quietly. "It's not about orders, rules, or appearances. It's about trust, and you earn it every single day, not through words, but through what you do." David nodded, acknowledging the insight. "Exactly. And it's not easy. Some days people won't understand. Some days mistakes happen. But every time we try, every time we choose patience over pride, understanding over judgment, we make a difference." Miller felt a lump in his throat. He realized how many times he had chosen judgment over understanding, how often assumptions had clouded his actions. For the first time, he truly wanted to do better, not because of shame, but because he now understood the impact of his choices. As the fair continued, Miller began helping children with the activities, guiding them gently, explaining safely how equipment worked, and answering their questions honestly. People started noticing a change. Residents who had been wary of the police presence now smiled at Miller, acknowledging his efforts. He realized that actions had the power to heal what words alone could not. Meanwhile, David watched quietly, letting Miller take the initiative without interference. He recognized the sincerity, but he also knew that true growth took time. Respect couldn't be forced. It had to be demonstrated and lived. By the end of the day, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the fair. Children waved goodbye, parents thanked the volunteers, and a sense of calm pride filled the air. Miller and David stood together, surveying the scene. "You know," Miller said softly, "I used to think that being right mattered more than being kind. That authority mattered more than understanding, but now I see that the real measure of a person is how they treat others when no one is watching." David smiled faintly. "And it's never too late to start. Every day is a chance to do better, to learn, and to make a positive impact." Miller nodded, feeling a quiet resolve. "Thank you, David, for showing me what real strength looks like. I won't forget it." Neither man spoke again for a while. Words were not necessary. They both understood that actions, patience, and consistency mattered more than conversations. But in that silence, a mutual respect had formed, one built on observation, honesty, and courage. That night, Miller walked home slowly, reflecting on the past weeks. He thought about the traffic stop, the fire, the community fair, and the lessons he had learned. It was humbling, but in a way that felt freeing. He no longer needed to prove himself. He simply needed to act with integrity every day in every choice. David returned to the fire station, tired but content. He thought about the fair, the children, the residents, and even the officer who had once doubted him. He knew that the real work wasn't over. Life would continue to challenge people in ways that required patience, calmness, and courage. But he also knew that moments like this, when understanding and respect replaced fear and judgment, were the moments that mattered most. Over the following weeks, the town began to feel a subtle shift. Miller's actions were consistent, visible, but never boastful. Residents noticed the change, children felt safer, and even his colleagues commented on how he seemed more approachable, more thoughtful. He had become someone who led not just with authority, but with empathy. David, quietly observing, felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition. He had seen someone transform not because of confrontation, but because of example, because of action, because of living the values he had always believed in. The encounter on Oak Street, the fire, the conversations, they had all led to this moment. Two men, once divided by misunderstanding and assumption, now standing together, quietly making their community stronger, calmer, and safer. And in that, both of them understood something vital. Justice is not always about punishment or revenge. Sometimes justice is about realization, about learning, and about the courage to change for the better. Life in the town slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, but something had changed beneath the surface. The fire that had once struck fear into the hearts of the residents had become more than a story of danger. It was a story of courage, learning, and quiet justice. People no longer remembered only the flames or the smoke. They remembered the calm bravery of the firefighter who risked everything for others, and the lesson in humility it had sparked in a local officer. The officer, Miller, had continued to reflect on the past events. Each day he felt the weight of responsibility in a new way. He no longer saw his role as simply enforcing rules or asserting authority. He now understood that his decisions affected real people, their trust, their sense of safety, and their respect for those in uniform. This realization had shifted something fundamental in him. He started waking up earlier, not just to patrol the streets, but to think about how he could genuinely contribute to the community. He volunteered for programs he had once ignored, helped organize local safety initiatives, and even joined David in fire safety demonstrations. He wasn't doing it for recognition. He was doing it because he now knew that trust and respect were earned through consistent, thoughtful actions. David noticed the changes quietly. He didn't need to tell anyone about them. They were visible in Miller's behavior. Residents began to greet the officer with smiles instead of caution, and children waved when he approached, no longer intimidated but curious. David understood that real transformation was subtle. It wasn't flashy. It was built on consistent deeds, humility, and genuine care. One afternoon, the fire station hosted a community event to teach families about fire prevention. David was, as usual, at the center of the activity, explaining the importance of smoke detectors, fire escape routes, and basic emergency procedures. Miller was there assisting with organizing tables, helping children try on firefighter gear, and answering questions from parents about safety. A young boy tugged at Miller's sleeve and asked nervously, "Do you help people like firefighters do?" Miller knelt down, looking the boy in the eye. "Yes," he said softly. "We all help each other in different ways. Firefighters, police, neighbors. Everyone has a role. What matters is that we try our best." The boy smiled and ran off to join his friends. Miller watched him go, realizing how different his approach had become. He no longer acted out of authority or fear. He acted out of empathy and understanding. Each small interaction, each choice to listen and guide rather than judge was making a difference. David approached him quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing well," he said. "People notice when actions are genuine. Keep it up." Miller nodded, feeling a sense of quiet pride. Not pride in the way he used to feel, which was tied to ego, but pride in the knowledge that he was slowly becoming someone better, someone worthy of respect not just in uniform, but as a human being. The town, too, was feeling the effects of these changes. Residents spoke differently about authority figures. They shared stories of kindness, courage, and mutual respect. The fire, once remembered as a moment of chaos, was now a turning point, a reminder that even in tragedy, people could rise to show their best selves. One evening, a month after the fire, the town held a small gathering to honor those who had helped during the emergency. It wasn't a grand ceremony. Just neighbors, families, and local officials coming together to acknowledge bravery and teamwork. David was invited, as were other firefighters, first responders, and volunteers. Miller attended quietly without expectation.